So I think we all kind of assume that maturity is basically just a biological timer, right?
Right, yeah, like it just happens.
Exactly. Like you hit 25, your prefrontal cortex finishes baking, a bell dings somewhere in your head, and, boom, congratulations, you are a fully mature adult.
Yeah, standard conventional wisdom.
But we are looking at a really provocative new white paper today that argues that it's just a complete myth. Maturity isn't a timer at all. It's actually a tripwire.
And it's a tripwire that, according to the data, millions of people are completely missing right now.
Exactly. So if you, the listener, have ever looked around and felt like society is, I don't know, acting more and more like a giant high school cafeteria, well, this deep dive might honestly explain everything.
It's such a profound paradigm shift, too,
Yeah.
because we are taking this framework that we usually only apply to, like individual psychology, and we're using it to diagnose the structural architecture of an entire civilization.
And that is our exact mission for today. We are unpacking this 2026 white paper. It's called The Threshold, and it was published by the Prothean Institute.
Specifically, it's paper 3 of their civilizational architecture series, right?
Right. And the core argument they make is that human maturity is a triggered state, not a timed outcome. And we're going to explore what predictably happens to a society when it systematically delays that trigger or just removes it entirely.
But to really get what this trigger is, we kind of have to start with the biological timeline first.
Yeah, because there's this massive glaring tension between our human biology and how modern society actually functions right now.
The paper frames it perfectly. It's a collision between reproductive capability and cognitive demand. So if we look at this strictly through an evolutionary lens,
Just the raw biology of it.
right, female reproductive capability arrives around, age 13 to 15. And the white paper points to this incredibly robust study by Lassick and Gollin.
Which is a huge study, right?
Massive. They analyzed 1.128 million maternal records. Yeah, it gives this immense statistical power. And the data clearly shows that the biological optimum for optimal delivery and pregnancy, it peaks in that 13 to 22 window.
Okay, so every independent biological measure basically converges on the late teens to early 20s as like the absolute peak period for physical outcomes for both the mother and the child.
Exactly. That is the biological reality.
But, I mean, let's be real here. A 16-year-old today absolutely cannot participate in the modern economy.
Yeah, of course not.
Like in a hunter-gatherer society, a 16-year-old probably already knew literally everything they needed to know to survive. But today, you can't be a civil engineer or a lawyer or, a surgeon at 16.
Right. We require this incredibly extended period of education just to achieve a baseline of cognitive participation in society.
Right.
And that cognitive demand inherently pushes family formation significantly later. Now, I should mention, the paper makes a very crucial distinction here.
Yeah, the part about the age of consent.
Yes. It is emphatically not attacking the culturally evolved age of consent at 18.
Right.
That threshold is presented as a healthy, generationally tested compromise. It allows for extended education while still keeping family formation accessible within that optimal biological window.
So what's the actual problem then?
The diagnosis, the pathology the paper is identifying, is the additional 15-year delay, pushing it way into the mid to late 30s. That has become the new structural norm.
Which brings us to a concept in the paper that, honestly, it completely changed how I view human development. They call it the two-phase model of maturity.
It's a fascinating framework.
Because the standard literature usually just presents one phase, right? Like your brain finishes developing in your mid-20s, and that's it. You're mature.
Yeah, the standard view assumes that because the prefrontal cortex finishes its primary maturation around, say, 25, the hardware is just fully operational.
But the two-phase model says neural development is only phase 1.
Exactly. Phase 1 provides the biological substrate. It's just the potential for maturity. Phase 2 is the triggered state. So the argument here is that the substrate can be fully present and totally biologically complete without the mature state ever actually activating.
You know what this reminds me of? Let's unpack this for a second. It's basically like pouring concrete, right?
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, so like phase 1 is mixing and pouring the wet concrete into the mold. That builds the physical capacity. But phase 2 is the chemical curing process that actually locks it into a load-bearing state.
Yes.
Without the trigger, you don't have a solid foundation. You just have a puddle of wet concrete sitting there indefinitely.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. You've got the raw materials, but you entirely lack the structural integrity to bear a heavy load.
Okay, so the natural question is, what actually cures the concrete?
Right. The paper identifies a very specific trigger for this, and it requires 4 distinct elements to happen simultaneously.
Okay, play them out.
So you need non-optional obligation, asymmetric dependency, delayed reward, and continuous accountability.
Let's actually break those down because they're pretty heavy concepts.
Go for it.
So non-optional obligation means you literally cannot quit. You
Well,
can't just walk away.
right.
Asymmetric dependency means someone else's welfare depends on you vastly more than your welfare depends on them. Delayed reward means the payoff is, years away.
Mm-hmm.
And continuous accountability means you face the consequences of your actions every single day with absolutely no breaks.
And historically, caring for dependent children activates all 4 of those massive stressors simultaneously.
Simultaneously.
And we really need to look at the neurobiology of why this works, because it's not just a poetic metaphor.
It's physical.
It is. The paper highlights neuroimaging studies of first-time biological fathers.
Oh, this part was wild.
It's critical data because these men, they don't gestate, they don't experience the hormonal cascade of pregnancy or childbirth.
Right.
Yet during the period of active caregiving, their brains show significant structural gray matter reorganization, specifically in regions implicated in parental motivation and threat detection.
Wait, really? So the physical brain actually rewires itself just from the sheer act of taking on the responsibility?
Literally. The mechanism is the responsibility structure itself. The relentless, high-stakes attention required to keep an infant alive. It essentially forces the brain's plasticity to prune certain neural pathways and strengthen others.
Wow.
The reward circuits literally shift from self-oriented outcomes to other-oriented outcomes. And the expert notes this applies to adoptive parents, active step-parents, biological fathers, anyone doing the continuous care.
So the continuous, inescapable commitment is the actual proxy that causes the biological transformation.
Exactly.
Okay, so if phase 2 is the curing process, we really need to talk about the properties of that wet concrete. Because to understand this so-called entry state, the paper asks us to completely flip how we view teenage psychology.
It really does.
I'll admit, I kind of struggled with this at first.
Well, it requires abandoning a lot of standard psychological assumptions. I mean, typically we look at adolescence and we see traits like emotional intensity, identity fluidity, present orientation, and this certain level of, unearned entitlement.
Oh, absolutely.
And the conventional wisdom treats all of these as developmental liabilities. They're flaws. They are just the messy parts of growing up that we need to outgrow so we can become functional adults.
Right, but the threshold argues those aren't bugs at all.
Yeah.
They are perfectly calibrated evolutionary features.
Yeah.
Like they're the raw materials, the exact entry state designed intentionally by evolution to be converted by this family formation trigger.
Yeah. Let's look at the actual mechanics of that conversion. Take present orientation, for example.
Right.
The adolescent brain has this hyper-focus on the immediate moment, right? They really struggle with long-term planning. Under the standard view, that's a massive flaw.
Because they can't plan for the future.
Right. But when the trigger hits, that present orientation doesn't just disappear. It gets converted into maternal or paternal presence. A new parent has to completely ignore their, 5-year career plan to focus entirely on an infant's immediate urgent need right this very second.
Oh, wow. And identity fluidity. Think about being a teenager. You're constantly trying on different personalities, different friend groups, different aesthetics.
Constantly shifting.
Yeah. And the paper suggests that fluidity exists specifically so a person can radically reorganize their entire self-concept around a dependent child and do it without feeling like they're experiencing some traumatic loss of themselves.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that the same principle applies to adolescent resistance to authority.
The rebellion phase.
Yes, that friction teenagers have against their parents and teachers.
Yeah.
That doesn't just vanish into thin air either. It's redirected. Once the trigger occurs, that resistance turns into a fierce protective instinct against outside institutions on behalf of the child. So the mother who will aggressively confront a school principal or demand a second opinion from a pediatrician, she's deploying the exact same cognitive feature that made her rebel against her curfew at 16.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Okay.
Because here is where I really, really need to push back.
Right.
I was reading the section on adolescent entitlement. Expecting a reward without any immediate proof that you actually deserve it. How on earth is entitlement a biological feature? Because anyone who has spent 5 minutes with a teenager knows that entitlement is incredibly destructive.
It definitely seems destructive in a vacuum, I'll give you that. But the paper argues it is actually a vital evolutionary persistence mechanism.
How so?
Think of it as the blind faith required to commit to an ordeal. If we zoom out, evolution faces a massive design problem with human beings. How do you get a rational, highly intelligent, self-interested organism to willingly commit to 20 years of sleep deprivation, massive caloric and financial drain, and the total subordination of their own needs?
Right, because if you put that on a spreadsheet, a fully mature, rational adult calculating costs and benefits would just run for the hills.
The math doesn't make sense.
The math is terrible for the individual.
It is terrible. So nature doesn't let the fully rational, calculating adult make the decision. Nature uses what the paper calls a self-transcendence loop.
A self-transcendence loop.
Yes. It leverages those exact adolescent traits, the emotional intensity, the present orientation, the unearned faith in a future reward, to essentially recruit the organism into the commitment before they can overthink it.
Oh, that is wild.
Right. And once the commitment is made, the inescapable responsibility structure kicks in. That structure then converts those very traits into mature adult functioning. The ordeal itself actually becomes the source of their mature identity.
Okay, so evolution basically gives us the perfect lock, which is the entry state, and the perfect key, which is the trigger.
Precisely.
But what happens when society forces a 15-year gap between the lock and the key? Because that is the reality for millions of people today. We spend our 20s and 30s completely focusing on our careers.
And the paper describes this as the double damage of modernity.
Double damage.
Yeah. The first layer of damage is just the delay itself. If you push the trigger from the early 20s to the late 30s, it hits a brain that is fundamentally less plastic.
It's rigid.
Exactly. Neuroimaging confirms this reality. Older first-time mothers show attenuated, meaning significantly reduced gray matter restructuring compared to much younger mothers. The brain has simply had way more time to stabilize and calcify around different functional demands.
Wait, so it's a timing issue. Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like, if you hit the trigger at 20, you're essentially installing a brand new operating system on a totally blank hard drive.
Right. It installs cleanly.
Exactly. But if you wait until you're 38, you are trying to install that same heavy operating system on a hard drive. It's already running 5 massive, highly configured applications in the background. The system is just going to crash, or at least run with a massive amount of friction.
That is a very apt way to visualize the substrate disruption. But the second layer of damage is arguably even worse.
Worse than a crashing system.
Yeah, because we don't just delay the trigger. Modern society actively dismantles the entry state while we wait.
What do you mean?
Think about what a 15-year professional pipeline actually requires of a person. It demands that you train your present orientation into meticulous long-term career planning.
Oh, wow.
It forces your identity fluidity to consolidate into a highly rigid professional identity.
Yeah.
Your emotional intensity has to be entirely suppressed in favor of, professional regulation and corporate composure.
And it's not even just the workplace. Culturally, we exercise our emotional systems in the exact wrong direction, too. Well, we encourage people to spend their 20s engaging in serial, non-attaching relationships. You date someone, it doesn't work out, you break up, you move on. You are literally training your affective system to bond and detach, which is the literal opposite of what the biological trigger requires, which is permanent, inescapable attachment.
Exactly. And when you look at the delay and the dismantling together, it perfectly explains a deeply painful modern phenomenon. It explains why our culture increasingly views children as burdens or obstacles to self-actualization.
And this is where the paper requires a lot of empathy, I think.
Yeah.
It's very clear that this isn't some hostile ideological campaign against families. The people describing parenthood as a loss of self-fiction. They were giving an accurate, truthful report of their lived experience.
They are reporting the structural friction. I mean, to a 38-year-old who has spent 15 years heavily consolidating a professional identity, an infant truly is a massive disruption to their neurological substrate.
Yeah.
The identity reorganization that is supposed to be somewhat seamless at 22, it registers as a traumatic loss of self at 38. Because the self was already fully built, locked in, and optimized for an environment that is completely incompatible with a baby.
They aren't biologically broken, they're just trapped in a structural mismatch.
Exactly.
And this double damage, it completely fractures the mating market too. Like if you are listening to this and you've tried dating in your 30s recently, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Millions of people are just completely missing each other.
Yes, the paper details a severe mating market mismatch. Evolutionarily, men naturally select for features of the intact entry state in women.
Like what?
Things like adaptability, receptivity, emotional availability, playfulness. Women, conversely, naturally select for displayed maturity in men, impulse control, reliable provisioning, emotional stoicism, and long time horizons.
But because of the modern professional pipeline, women are actively shaped away from those entry state features by the time they feel financially ready to actually form a family.
Right.
They've had to become rigid and fiercely independent just to survive the corporate world. Meanwhile, young men are increasingly buffered from real-world consequences entirely.
Oh, absolutely. They find simulated status and achievement in video games or online subcultures.
Right. So they never experience the friction required to develop the displayed maturity traits that women are actively looking for.
Both biological selection mechanisms are functioning exactly as evolution designed them over hundreds of thousands of years, but they are no longer converging. Men and women are scanning the environment for traits that the other side simply isn't producing at the required rate anymore.
Man, okay, so we spent a lot of time on the individual psychology here. But society isn't just a collection of isolated individuals. What happens to the actual fabric of a civilization when millions of people miss the trigger for 50 years?
It scales up.
Right. When an entire generation is stalled in phase one, the paper calls this civilizational adolescence.
And the demographic data provides the starkest evidence of this rupture. So if we look at the 1930 cohort, women born nearly a century ago, they achieved a cumulative fertility of over 3 children by age 30.
Okay, 3 kids by 30.
By contrast, the 1990 cohort at that exact same age of 30 is at just 1.2 children.
Wow.
We are living through an unprecedented demographic and psychological event. This is the very first time in human history that an entire population cohort has systematically failed to encounter the biological trigger within the developmental window.
And you can feel it. I mean, if you're scrolling your feed right now or you're sitting in a corporate meeting, just observe the behavior around you. Does the public sphere feel like a room of deliberating, emotionally regulated adults? Or does it feel like a highly reactive, incredibly vindictive high school cafeteria?
Right.
The paper argues that the macro symptoms of incomplete maturation are basically dominating our public culture now.
And the symptoms map seamlessly onto that unconverted adolescent entry state we discussed earlier. Look at our workplaces and civic spaces. You see widespread entitlement without preceding responsibility.
Oh, everywhere.
Individuals demanding high status, massive reward, and systemic validation before demonstrating any sustained contribution.
Right.
You see status competition driven by signaling correct opinions and enforcing social cliques rather than through demonstrated frictional competence.
And cancel culture. I mean, the paper does not mince words here. It literally defines cancel culture as schoolyard social exclusion. It's the exact kind of reputational destruction you see in middle school, but exported to adult institutions, with zero proportionality and zero pathway for redemption.
Which brings us to a really critical vulnerability in our political systems. The white paper introduces this concept of Madisonian architecture failing under these new inputs.
Okay, can we dig into the Madisonian architecture part? Because James Madison helped design the U.S. Constitution. What does he have to do with biological brain development?
Well, Madison and the other architects designed a constitutional and institutional framework that implicitly assumes cognitively mature actors. A constitutional republic requires long time horizons. It requires the ability to delay gratification, the capacity to tolerate profound disagreement without experiencing it as an existential threat, and the willingness to compromise.
Right. It's a slow, deliberate machine.
Exactly. This system does not require everyone to be highly virtuous. Madison famously said if men were angels, no government would be necessary, but it absolutely requires mature phase 2 cognition as its baseline operating input.
So if you take an adolescent entry state brain, which, as we established, is biologically hyper-focused on the present, highly emotionally reactive, and views authority as something to rebel against, and you plug millions of those brains into a Madisonian machine.
The machine tears itself apart.
Wow.
Yes, the system relies on slow deliberation. The adolescent entry state demands immediate validation, and the paper specifically points to the rise of what it calls emotion-driven discourse.
What does that mean, practically?
It's this phenomenon where people use their internal emotional state as an epistemic authority, rather than relying on shared principles or objective reality. The logic basically becomes, I feel this strongly, therefore it must be true, and for you to disagree with my feeling is a literal act of violence against me.
Well, we really need to do an impartiality check here, because the paper makes it explicitly clear that this isn't a partisan issue.
Right. It is crucial to note that the paper observes this phenomenon across the entire political spectrum.
Yeah.
You see emotion-driven discourse and institutional purity spirals dominating progressive spaces just as much as right-wing populist movements.
Right. We are not taking a side here, and neither is the white paper. We're just reporting their diagnosis.
Exactly. It is not an ideological failure. It is a structural failure. The dysfunction of contemporary democratic institutions isn't simply about bad policy or corrupt politicians. It's the predictable output of an architectural system designed for a mature population that our developmental pipeline no longer reliably produces.
That is just staggering. Like, the political chaos isn't the disease. It's a symptom of a biological stalling out.
Yeah.
Let's bring this all together for everyone. The core journey we've been on today completely shatters how we usually think about growing up. Maturity is not guaranteed by time. You do not just age into it.
No, you don't.
It requires a raw biological entry state, a high-stakes trigger of non-optional responsibility, and the societal timing to actually match them up.
And the unavoidable conclusion of the threshold is that modernity has systematically dismantled that pipeline. We delay the trigger to accommodate the knowledge economy, we dismantle the entry state through professional and cultural incentives, and the result is a society that acts its delayed developmental stage rather than its chronological age.
And we really want to reiterate something very clearly. If you are listening to this, whether you are a parent feeling the intense friction of having a child in your late 30s, or a professional entirely focused on your career, or someone struggling to navigate the modern dating market, this deep dive is not a judgment on your individual life choices.
Not at all.
It's the exact opposite. It's a lens for immense empathy. It explains the collective anxiety and the chaotic institutional behavior surrounding all of us.
The structural conditions of our civilization has shifted drastically beneath our feet. We are all simply reacting to the complex incentives and the heavily delayed timelines placed in front of us by the modern economy.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on this framework but looks a little further toward the future.
Oh, this is a good point.
Yeah. So the white paper heavily focuses on family formation as the historical trigger, right? That non-optional obligation and continuous accountability. But let's look at the modern professional world. We have AI and automation rapidly entering the workforce. They are actively removing friction, removing non-optional obligation, and outsourcing the continuous accountability from our work lives as well.
And that raises a very, very unsettling prospect, because if the professional sphere becomes buffered from real consequence and deep frictional problem solving, just as family formation has been delayed.
Exactly. If both family and work stop demanding deep, inescapable responsibility from us, where will future generations find the tripwire to grow up at all? The high school cafeteria never actually closes. How do we ever graduate? Food for thought.